The spotlight slid off Dean Martin's face and locked onto the woman in the front row. She screamed once, covered her eyes, and her husband shot to his feet. Wait, because Dean saw it happen half a second before anyone else understood what was wrong, and the choice he made in that instant would decide whether the room stayed calm or exploded into panic. The Sands nightclub was packed wall to wall that Thursday in June, 1,800 people crammed into a space built for 1,200. Cigarette smoke hung thick under the stage lights, the air conditioning losing its fight against body heat and perfume and bourbon. The tables were so close together that waiters had to turn sideways to squeeze through with their trays held high. Every seat was filled. People were standing 3 deep at the bar. The room smelled like money and sweat and the kind of optimism that only shows up after the 3rd drink. Dean had just finished the 2nd verse of "Everybody Loves Somebody," his voice smooth as aged whiskey, when the beam jerked hard to the left, like it had been yanked by an invisible hand, and pinned itself on a blonde woman, maybe 30 years old, sitting 3 tables back from the stage. The light was industrial strength, the kind they used for outdoor concerts where you needed to cut through ambient light and reach the back row of a stadium. 2,000 watts of raw white heat compressed into a circle 3 feet wide. It hit her straight in the face with the force of a physical blow. Dean saw her pupils contract to pinpoints in the split second before she threw her hands up, saw the moment of confusion cross her face before the pain registered, watched her mouth open in the beginnings of a scream. The brightness was so intense that for a moment her skin looked translucent, like you could see straight through to the bones underneath, every vein visible beneath the surface. Her wedding ring flashed like a signal mirror, throwing reflected light across the ceiling in wild arcs. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Her scream wasn't loud, but it cut through the music clean. Dean's hand froze mid-gesture, martini glass still tilted, and he watched her fold forward with both palms pressed against her face. The man beside her, tall, dark suit, wedding ring catching the light, stood so fast his chair tipped backward and cracked against the floor. That sound, wood on tile, sharp and final, made half the room turn. The other half kept watching Dean, waiting for the punchline they assumed was coming. Dean lowered the microphone slowly. The band kept playing for 3 more beats before the piano player caught the look on Dean's face and lifted his hands off the keys. The drums stuttered to a stop. The whole room went quiet in sections, like dominoes falling, until the only sound left was the woman's ragged breathing and the hum of the spotlight still burning into the table. Notice what Dean did next, because he didn't move toward her. He turned his head slowly to the right, toward the lighting booth high up near the back wall, and he raised one hand, not frantic, not angry, just a slow, deliberate motion, and made a cutting gesture across his throat. The spotlight died. The room dropped into half-darkness, just the house lights and the red glow from the exit signs, and for a moment, nobody moved. "Somebody get the house lights up," Dean said into the microphone, voice calm, almost casual. "And somebody find out if that lady needs a doctor." 2 waiters in black vests were already moving through the tables. The husband was kneeling beside his wife now, one hand on her shoulder, talking low and fast. Dean set his glass down on the piano and stepped to the edge of the stage. Her hands were still covering her eyes, and when she finally lowered them, Dean could see the red streaks running down her cheeks. Not blood. Tears. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and even from 10 feet away, he could see her lids were swollen. The room started to shift. People were standing, leaning in, whispering to each other. Someone near the bar said something about calling an ambulance. Dean heard it and shook his head. "Hold on," he said, louder now. "Let's just hold on a second." He crouched at the edge of the stage, one knee on the wood, still holding the microphone. "Ma'am," he said, quieter, "can you hear me?" She nodded, eyes still shut. "Can you open your eyes?" She tried, got them halfway, then squeezed them shut again and shook her head. Dean looked at the husband. "How long was the light on her?" "I don't know," the man said. His voice was shaking. 5 seconds, 10, maybe more. I wasn't counting. She just started screaming. "It's okay," Dean said. He stood and turned back to the crowd. Listen to how the room reacts in the next few seconds, because this is the moment that separates a performer from someone who just knows how to sing. Dean raised the microphone and smiled. Not a big showbiz grin, just a small, tired smile, the kind you give a friend when something goes wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, letting the words settle over the room like a blanket, waiting for absolute silence before continuing. "I've been doing this job a long time, 20 years, give or take a few that I'm trying to forget." That got a few nervous laughs. "And I've seen a lot of things go sideways. Microphones die in the middle of a high note. Bands forget what key we're in. I once had a gentleman in the front row fall asleep during my best ballad, snoring loud enough that I could hear it over the orchestra." More laughs now, spreading from table to table like a contagion, but I have never, and I mean never, seen a spotlight with that kind of personal vendetta against a paying customer. The laughs were coming easier now, the fear in the room breaking apart like ice under spring sun. "I think that light saw her before I did," Dean continued, shifting his weight glass still in hand, took one look at this lovely lady and thought, "Now there's the real star of this show. Forget this dino character, let's give her the full treatment." He paused, counted 2 beats in his head, let the anticipation build. "Unfortunately, nobody told the light that we're supposed to ease people into stardom. You don't just blast someone with enough wattage to cook a turkey and call it an audition." Dean glanced back at the woman. One of the waiters had brought her water and a damp cloth. She was pressing the cloth against her eyes, breathing slower. The husband was still kneeling, but his shoulders had dropped. "Here's what we're going to do," Dean said. "We're going to take a 10-minute break. I'm going to make sure this lady is okay, and somebody's going to have a serious conversation with the guy in that lighting booth." Another wave of laughter. "And then we're coming back, and I promise you I will stay directly under the light from now on." Dean stepped off the stage, the polished wood of the steps creaking slightly under his weight, and walked straight to the woman's table, ignoring the hands reaching out from nearby tables to shake his, ignoring the voices calling his name, asking if everything was okay, offering suggestions. He crouched beside her chair, one knee on the floor, close enough now to see the mascara streaked down her cheeks, the way her hands were trembling, even though she was trying to hold them still. "You doing okay?" he asked, voice low enough that only she and her husband could hear him over the ambient noise of the room. She lowered the cloth slowly, like she was afraid of what she might find when she opened her eyes. They were open now, still red, still watery. The whites shot through with broken capillaries that would probably take a few days to heal, but open. "I think so," she said, and her voice was hoarse, ragged from the screaming and the crying and probably from holding her breath without realizing it. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to ruin your show." "Don't," Dean said, cutting her off before she could finish the thought. "You didn't do anything wrong. That light could have cooked a steak at 50 paces. He reached into his jacket pocket, the inside one where he kept his walking around money, separate from the folded bills he used for tips, and pulled out a 50. He set it on the table, smoothing it flat with 2 fingers. "That's for the cab home, and for the trouble, and if you want to come back next week, you let them know at the door that you're my guest, and I'll make sure you get a table in the very back corner, as far away from that psychotic spotlight as architecturally possible." She laughed, a short, surprised sound, and nodded. Dean walked backstage through the narrow corridor that smelled like decades of cigarette smoke soaked into the walls, past the dressing rooms with their closed doors and muffled voices, past the storage area where they kept the extra chairs and broken music stands. The lighting operator, a skinny kid, maybe 22, with acne scars on his cheeks and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, was already standing in the hallway near the stage entrance with his hands jammed deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched, face pale as printer paper. His eyes were red. He'd been crying, or was about to start. "Mr. Martin," he said, voice cracking on the second syllable like a teenager going through puberty, "I swear to God I didn't mean to. The controller, it slipped out of my hand, and when I grabbed for it, the dial spun, and I tried to correct it, but the wheel stuck for a second, and by the time I got it back under control, she was already—" "I know," Dean said, and he said it gently, the way you'd talk to a frightened animal, cutting the kid off before he could spiral into a full, panicked confession that would just make both of them feel worse. "I know it was an accident, but here's the thing you need to understand." He stepped closer, close enough that the kid had to tilt his head back slightly to meet his eyes. "That lady out there, she just got a face full of light that could have done permanent damage, could have blinded her, could have scarred her corneas. You understand what I'm telling you?" The kid nodded fast, 3 times in quick succession, Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "So here's what's going to happen," Dean continued, keeping his voice level, controlled. "You're going to sit the rest of this show out. You're going to go home, get some sleep, maybe have a stiff drink if that's your thing, and tomorrow morning you're going to come back here and you're going to explain to the manager exactly what happened, exactly what went wrong mechanically, and exactly how you're going to make sure it never happens again. You're going to practice with that light board until you can operate it drunk, half asleep, and blindfolded. You with me?" Another nod, even faster this time. Dean went back to his dressing room, closed the door, and sat down on the couch. His hands were shaking, not a lot, but enough that he noticed when he reached for the bottle of scotch. He poured 2 fingers and drank it in one swallow, felt the burn settle warm in his chest. The room was quiet except for the ventilation humming overhead and the muffled noise of the crowd settling back into their seats, ready to move on. But here's the part you really need to notice. Dean didn't go back out for 12 minutes. Not 10, 12. And during those 2 extra minutes, he stood in front of the mirror and practiced his smile 3 times. Not because he didn't know how to smile. Dean had been smiling professionally since he was 17, but he needed to make sure that when he walked back out, the audience wouldn't see a man who was rattled. They'd see Dean Martin, cool, unshakable, the guy who could turn a near disaster into a punchline without breaking a sweat. When he finally stepped back onto the stage, the applause was immediate and loud. Dean raised his hand and the noise dropped. "All right," he said, "let's try this one more time, and if that spotlight twitches, I'm using it as a weapon." The band kicked in. Dean started singing, and somewhere in the back of the room, the woman with the burned eyes was already walking out with her husband's arm around her shoulders, and she was smiling. Years later, a reporter asked Dean if he remembered that night. Dean was older then, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and late nights. He thought about it for a long time before he answered. "Yeah," he said, "I remember. That was the night I learned you can't control everything that happens on stage. But you can control what happens after, and sometimes that's the only thing that matters." The room didn't explode into panic that Thursday in June. The woman's eyes healed. The lighting operator got better at his job. And Dean Martin finished his set, drank his scotch, and went home knowing he'd done the one thing a performer is supposed to do when everything goes wrong. He kept the room together, not with a song, not with a joke, but with the choice he made in the moment when it mattered most. And that spotlight? They replaced it 2 days later. The new one worked fine, but the crew never forgot the night the old one tried to steal the show.